بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. Because I probably will raise my voice a bit as we're going on. So maybe you can turn it down a bit. From here it seems a bit bassy and a bit loud. Okay, the request. Too close to you, okay. The request was that we speak about the 10th of Muharram and also the tragedy that historically occurred on this day, which is the killing or the martyrdom of the younger of the Prophet's grandson, Al-Hussein radiyallahu anhu. And the request was that, could I explain, are the two linked in any way? The 10th of Muharram and the fact that in the Sahih Sunnah and in the authentic hadith, the 10th of Muharram has a virtue, a fadila. And is that fadila or virtue linked in any way to the martyrdom, the tragic killing of Al-Hussein, which happened on that same day back in history? And it's an issue as well because from there we get into some unfortunate sectarian division, normally the Sunni-Shia divide. And sometimes, even amongst mainstream Sunni people, the followers of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, sometimes the 10th of Muharram and how you respond to it, or how you don't respond to it, sometimes becomes a cause of division and enmity between the hearts of even people who adhere to the overall mainstream Sunni path or the way of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. And the issue is, on the one hand, rather simple, and yet on the other hand, a little bit tricky. It's simple because what the Prophet ﷺ said about the 10th of Muharram, which, if you're following one calendar, the 10th of Muharram, the 10th day of Muharram was today, and if you're following the other calendar, the 10th day of Muharram was yesterday, so it's not too far. On the one hand, it's simple because the Prophet ﷺ made it very clear what the particular distinction or fadila of the 10th of Muharram is and what it's related to. And on the other hand, it's tricky because whenever you talk about an issue, especially a historical issue, and especially a socio-political historical issue, then normally people aren't present to see what's happening. We only know it by way of news, information, khabar, hadiths, riwayat, narrations. And some people narrate better than others. Some people narrate well, and some people narrate very badly. Some people are liars when they narrate. Some people are very truthful. Some people are truthful, but have a poor memory. Some people are truthful, have a good memory, but when they see something or hear something, they don't have good understanding. And so sometimes they narrate what they see and what they hear, and sometimes they narrate their poor understanding with it. And then occasionally you get good narrators with good understanding, with truthfulness, and their reports should take precedence. But the reality is most Muslims wouldn't know where to start to take their historical information from about events in Islam. Of course, most Muslims know that historical events in Islam, they're not going to find on CNN, BBC, Sky News. But where to take them from? So then that becomes a bit tricky. So let's start, inshallah, at the best beginning. which is that the 10th of Muharram, and Muharram is the first month of the Islamic year, and it's a sacred month, and in the authentic hadiths, the Prophet ﷺ encouraged that Muharram be a recommended month to fast. Doesn't matter what day, it's encouraged to fast as much as you can in the month of Muharram, and Muharram is the first month of the Islamic calendar, which now brings us into the year 1436 Hijri. 1436 years have passed since the Prophet ﷺ made the migration from Mecca to Medina, and in the time of Umar radiallahu anhu, when it was thought beneficial that we should have a dating system instead of the old Arab dating system. This is 50 years after the year of the elephant, okay, 90 years after the year of elephant, 400 years after Qusay did whatever he did in Mecca. They thought we need to have more of an accurate dating system, and so Umar radiallahu anhu, along with a shura, determined that we will start our dating system not from when the Prophet ﷺ is born, nor from when he ﷺ passes away, but from the time that he made that momentous journey from Mecca to Medina, the Hijrah, which then became a defining moment in the life of the Muslim community and in the life of Islam as a whole. And so 1436 years have now passed since that time. So we're in the year 1436 AH or Hijri, after Hijri, however we say it. And Muharram is the first month of that year, and it's one of the four sacred months of the Islamic calendar. And Allah has made it sacred in the Quran, and it was held sacred before the coming of Islam. And when the Prophet ﷺ made that migration from Mecca to Medina, he came to Medina, and Medina was an oasis town. It was a large town, or a small city, and it had various groups of people in it. It had large communities of Jews, and there were three main Jewish tribes in Medina, and they had been there a long while, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And along with them, there were two main Arab tribes, mainly mushrik, idolatrous, the Aus and the Khazraj. And the three Jewish tribes of Medina were the Banu Qaynuqa, the Banu Nadir, and Banu Qaynuqa, and Banu Qurayza, Barakallahu Fikum, Banu Qurayza. And these were the three main Jewish tribes, and they lived in the Jewish enclaves of Medina, and the rest lived wherever they lived. And the Jewish tribes were generally respected because they were known to be people of scripture, people who had received revelation, people who had a history of reading and writing, people had a history of suffering persecution and still surviving against the odds. So they were kind of respected by the mushriks, but at the same time resented as well. When the Prophet ﷺ came to Medina, he found that the Jewish tribes were celebrating this particular day of Muharram, the 10th day of Muharram, the day of Ashura. Ashura simply means the 10th. Okay? Ashura. Okay? Yawm al-Ashura is the 10th day. Yawm al-Tasi'a is the 9th day. So on and so forth. That's what it is. Ashura is the 10th. And he found that they were celebrating the 10th day. And so the Prophet ﷺ, and the hadith is in Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim, the Prophet ﷺ asked, why is it that the Jews are celebrating this particular day? And he was told that on this day, this is the day that Allah liberated Musa alayhi salam and the believers from the clutches of Pharaoh in Egypt and led them across the sea, eventually into the land that they were promised. And so in order to give thanks to Allah, we mark this day out as a day of celebration. And so the Prophet ﷺ responded by saying, we, meaning the Muslims, we have more right to Musa than they do, alayhi salam. We have more right to Moses than they do. Meaning, we are upon his deen, his religion, his aqidah, his beliefs, more than they are, because they have corrupted his religion over the thousands of years that have passed. We have more haqq to Musa alayhi salam than they do. And so the Prophet ﷺ made it recommended to fast out of shukr, out of thankfulness to Allah on that day in which Allah saved Musa alayhi salam and his qawm and his people from the tyranny, the dhulm of Fir'aun. Okay, and I don't know if whether the Jews call that time Passover or Yom Kippur, or Passover refers to the plagues that came just before the liberation, and Yom Kippur is the actual day. Obviously, I'm not a kind of learned in Jewish law and theology, but the Passover refers to the plagues passing over. And maybe Yom Kippur, or maybe it's called another name, is the 10th of Ashura, the actual day of liberation. So they still celebrate it. Whether that's the right name for it or not, I don't know. So that's really clear. Yom al-Ashura, fasting the 10th day of Yom al-Ashura, has nothing to do with any future incident that was going to happen, that happened in this case with his grandson, Al-Hussein radiyallahu anhu. It was simply to do with offering thanks and gratitude to Allah, shukr to Allah, for a huge blessing he sent down on that day, which was the day that Allah gave freedom to Musa alayhi salam and his people from Fir'aun. And that hadith is rigorously authentic, very sound, sahih. Now, also the sahih hadith, 1 year before the Prophet ﷺ passed away, he said, if I were to live the next year, I will fast a day before Ashura as well as Ashura, so as to be distinct from the Yahud, to be religiously distinct from them. But he ﷺ never reached that year to fast the 9th and the 10th. He passed away before that month. So it is recommended, the perfect sunnah is to fast Ashura and a day before it, 9th and 10th. Then the next perfect sunnah is, if that can't be done, to fast the 10th, Ashura, and a day after it. So at least there's another day. And if that couldn't happen, then at least to fast the day of Ashura itself. Whoever fasts the day of Ashura but doesn't fast the day before it, or a day after it, meaning a day along with it, hasn't done anything haram, hasn't done a bid'ah. It just means his reward is slightly less than the one who's done the perfect sunnah. And the Prophet ﷺ said, he who fasts the day of Ashura, his previous year's sins will be forgiven. Okay. Yawm al-Arafah, previous year's sins, and the future year's sins. Yawm al-Ashura, the previous year's sins. And all that has to do is with showing gratitude to Allah for his immense mercy in saving Musa alayhi salam and his qawm. There is a weak hadith, so it's not a sahih hadith, which says that this is the same day that Allah saved Nuh alayhi salam and the people on the ark. But the hadith is not authentic. So Ibn Rajab says, if it was authentic, then this is another, and it happened on the same day, Ashura, then it's, again, giving thanks to Allah for that blessed day of freedom and salvation. So as you can see, there is nothing in the narrations that tell us that we should, somehow the 10th of Muharram is connected to the martyrdom, the death, the tragic death of Al-Hussein radiyallahu anhu. And nor did the Prophet ﷺ say, make the first 10 days of Muharram days of mourning, days of wearing only black for grieving, days of not marrying, days of not eating sweets, days of sorrow and sadness. He didn't say anything like that. And we'll come on to the issue of Al-Hussein and Karbala and the tragedy in a minute. If the Sharia were to encourage us that when some righteous person, like Al-Hussein radiallahu anhu, dies, it should be a day of mourning, then there wouldn't be a single day in the year except that we will be mourning, grieving, making ma'tan, wearing black, not eating sweets. What day of the year is there except that some righteous servant of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has been tragically died? For example, Yahya alayhi salam, the cousin of Isa alayhi salam, John, the cousin of Jesus, prophets of God. He was killed by the governor of his time, and his head was decapitated. That's Yahya, and he's a Nabi, alayhi salam. But we don't single out his day for mourning. And there are other Anbiya and Rusul, alayhim as-salatu was-salam, who met tragic ends in their life. Not just they died naturally, they met tragic ends, brutal ends. But the Sharia doesn't tell us to mark that day out for mourning or grieving. Naturally, when you hear the story or you're reminded, hearts will grieve. There's no doubt we're talking about specifically marking the day out for a specific mourning. So, Sharia-wise, Shar'an, there is no doubt at all that the fasting of the 10th of Muharram and the virtue of the 10th of Muharram has nothing to do with the death or the martyrdom of any particular person. It's not to do with anything to do with death. It's to do with liberation on the day that Allah sent a blessing to the people of Moses, for which some of them were grateful and some of them weren't. Okay? But that's another story another time. Let's get on to the more trickier bit, which is, well, what happened on the 10th of Muharram so many hundreds and hundreds of years ago, so many centuries ago? Well, as I said to you before, it's not written in the Quran what happened on the day of Al-Husayn's martyrdom. It's not in the Hadith because it happened after the Prophet ﷺ. The incident at Karbala, which is present-day Iraq, where the tragedy took place, happened in the year 61 Hijrah. We're in the year 1436, 61 Hijrah, almost 50 years after the Prophet ﷺ passing away. Most of the Sahaba have passed away. The remaining Sahaba who were young when the Prophet ﷺ passed away are now very old. Ibn Abbas, Abdul ibn Umar, Abdul ibn Zubayr, Al-Husayn. Okay? They're in their 70s and 80s and 60s, and Al-Husayn is in his early 50s. Okay? That's the year 60, 61 Hijrah. Okay? So it's not in the Quran, it's not in the Hadith. We only know this through what? Through narrations. And some narrations and narrators are very reliable and some aren't. Sometimes we hear things on hearsay and it just becomes part of our history on hearsay, whether it's right or wrong. And that's the case to do with what happened on the 10th of Muharram in the year 61. A lot of it is just hearsay. A lot of it is, oh, I read in the newspaper. Okay? You want to take your history from a newspaper, whether it's an Arab newspaper or Urdu newspaper. So what can we do best? Well, scholars always point out that if we're going to take history, it needs to be done by the great scholar historians, the ulama of tariq, the scholars of Muslim history, such as, for example, the great master of them all, Imam al-Tabari. Imam al-Tabari is the master of the Quranic commentators, the Mufassirun, but he's also the master of the historians as well. He wrote a book which is Tariq al-Tabari in many, many, many volumes. Okay? And of course, he's one of the earliest, and he obviously mentions Karbala and the whole incident. After him, a few hundred years after him, there will be someone like Ibn al-Athir. He wrote Al-Kamil fi Tariq, one of the great histories of Islam, finishing up to his time, 6th Islamic century. About 100 years after him was the great famous scholar Imam Ibn Kathir. He wrote Al-Bidayah wa Nihaya, the beginning to the end, which was the history of the world up until his time. There are people like Imam Shamsuddin al-Dhahabi, rahmatullahi alayh, who doesn't write, well, he has a history, but it's a brief history on Islam, but he writes biographies, detailed biographies of all of the scholars. And in his famous 37-volume biography, Sir Alam al-Nubala, the biography of the noble ones, he obviously has an entry in the biography of Al-Husayn, okay, and what happened there, and Yazid, and his role in it, and so on and so forth. So from these type of sources, and the sources that follow, we can get a general picture about things that everybody agrees upon and about some of the differences. So today I'm going to just briefly paint a picture about what happened on the 10th of Muharram, 61 Hijri, of what happened in that tragedy. And I'll point out the basic things that everyone agrees on. And I'll point out some of the things in which there is some scholarly difference on. And then we'll reflect on what this means to us as Muslims today. So what happens? Well, after the Prophet ﷺ, Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu is Khalifa, then Umar, and then Uthman, and then Ali radiallahu anhum ajma'in. Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu dies a natural death. Umar and Uthman radiallahu anhum are killed. Someone stabbed Umar radiallahu anhu when he was praying. A group of rebels besieged the house of Uthman radiallahu anhu when he was held hostage there, not hostage, but surrounded there for a few weeks or months, and eventually people like Al-Hussein and Al-Hassan and Ibn Umar and some of the younger Sahaba who would have been about 20, that they were told by their elders to guard the house so the rebels can't get in and kill Uthman radiallahu anhu. But eventually they got at night time through the roof, came down and they stabbed him, and it's said in our history Uthman radiallahu anhu was reciting the Mus'haf, the Quran at that time. So he died tragically, and Ali radiallahu anhu died tragically. After Ali radiallahu anhu, we're talking about roughly 35 years after the Prophet ﷺ, okay, his son Al-Hassan, the older grandson of the Prophet ﷺ, he became Khalifa. But due to a complex situation, Muawiyah radiallahu anhu thought he had more right, because so much of the Syrians were already backing Muawiyah radiallahu anhu. So they negotiated, between Muawiyah and Hassan, they negotiated a settlement. And Al-Hassan abdicated. He stepped down from Khalifaship in order to keep the Ummah together. And he passed the Khilafah on, the rule of authority, onto Muawiyah radiallahu anhu, who became Khalifa. And the year Muawiyah became Khalifa, that time that Al-Hassan said, okay, I'm only doing this for Muslim unity, because me doing this will unite more of the people, and because I'm backing you, then all my followers will be happy, and your big followers will be happy, and the Ummah will be together. Because 5 years before that, for the last 5 years before that, there was civil war inside the Ummah, Muslims fighting Muslims. So the year Al-Hassan abdicates and the year Muawiyah radiallahu anhuma becomes Khalifa, it's called Amul Jama'ah, the year of unity. And the jihad to expand the borders and to fight the enemies continues after a 5-year absence. It's a historic moment. When Muawiyah is beginning to die, and Muawiyah radiallahu anhu, as Ibn Abbas says in Sahih Muslim, Muawiyah is a faqih. They said, one person said, we see Muawiyah praying 1 rak'ah witr. Because normally it's 3 rak'ah witr, right? So Ibn Abbas says, leave Muawiyah, for he is a faqih. And he is a big alim. And what he's seen from the Prophet, he knows best. Okay? So Muawiyah radiallahu anhu is not only the katib of the Quran, he scribes the Quran. When the wahi is coming to the Prophet, the Prophet has a few writers. Muawiyah is one of them. But also he's a faqih. And he's a great ruler as well. He's not as great a ruler as the 4 Khulafa Rashidun. And neither is he more pious than Al-Hassan. But he is pious, and he is knowledgeable, and he has great rulership skills. But when he is beginning to pass away, instead of making shura to consult and then get the next Khalifa, or instead of picking the one who seemingly deserves it the most, which would have been either Ibn Umar, or Ibn Abbas, or Abdullah ibn Zubayr, or Al-Hussein, would have been one of those 4, definitely. The people were behind them, they were the most knowledgeable, they were the most pious, they were the most deserving. He gave it to his son. For some reason, he gave it to his son Yazid. And Yazid doesn't have any of these qualities. He doesn't have piety. He's not up there with the great ones. Neither in knowledge, neither in piety, he's not even a Sahaba. But for some wisdom, Muawiyah gives it to Yazid. Yazid ibn Muawiyah. And the thing about Yazid is not only does he not have these qualities like Ibn Umar or Ibn Abbas or Abdullah ibn Zubayr anhum, but it is said that he was a drunkard, he committed fornication, and he had very bad deeds, and he would miss prayer. But this description about him is disputed between the scholars. Some scholars and righteous people at that time believed that's exactly how he was. Other scholars said, Wallahi, we have been in his presence and around him and we've never heard or seen anything like this. Whatever his reality was, our scholars differ. Was he a salih, a righteous man? Was he a fasik, a wicked sinner? Or was he in between? And normally it's either he was a wicked sinner or something in between. He had good qualities and bad qualities. No one says that he was such one of the only great awliya. I don't think any of the ulama say that. So when he is Khalifa, a large group of people, a significant group of people don't give him the bay'ah. And he knows, if he doesn't get the bay'ah, the oath of allegiance, the approval of Al-Hussein, who is the most loved of the people in his time. He is a Sahabi, he's pious, he's beautiful character, and he has the blood lineage of the Prophet ﷺ. This is the one who, along with his older brother Al-Hassan, who the Prophet ﷺ was in the masjid and lifted him up until his face was at the same height as the face of his grandson, and he went, "Oh Allah, I love them, you love them also." And he said about them one day that they are Sayyid al-Shabab Ahl al-Jannah. They are the leaders of the youths of Jannah, of paradise, Al-Hassan and Al-Hussein. And he also said, "He who loves them, loves me. He who hates them, hates me." And the bond between grandfather and grandchildren was so strong. There were times that one time he was in Sajda Salasa, and Al-Hussein or Al-Hassan was on his back, and he just stayed there for however long it was until they got off. He didn't even do the nice gentle, like get up a little bit to help them, he just stayed there until they got off. And as these two young men were growing up, they had the nur al-nubuwwah, they had the light of Prophet on them in terms of their character. And it is said in our history books, Al-Hassan and Al-Hussein so resembled the Prophet. The older resembled him physically, and the younger resembled him character-wise more so. Both resembled him in character-wise, but the younger even more so. Al-Hassan and Al-Hussein were incredibly generous people, even from a young age. Okay, even from a young age. They're riding on their horses, they're respected by people, and they find some woman with her children and some poor man there, and they get off their horse and they sit down and they share their meal just in the middle of the road. And normally the shurafa, noble people, they don't do that. They may give some money and sadaqah, but you don't stop and sit down and have dinner with the fuqara. But they're following in the footsteps of their grandfather, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. So there are 1,001 other reasons why these two children, why these two young men were loved by the people. And by the time he is 50, he's not only loved by the people, he's almost like, well, he's indirectly the spiritual leader of the ummah. So Yazid knows he needs the bay'ah of Al-Hussein, and Al-Hussein refused to give it. Abdullah ibn Zubayr refused to give it. Ibn Umar and Ibn Abbas refused to give it initially because they said, this is a strange thing, father just giving it to the son, and it's become like a dynasty. Instead of consulting the people or picking on the best ones. At least Abu Bakr then gave it to the next best person. Okay, so if he had done that, that would have been fine, but he gave it to just the son for whatever reason. We say that Muawiyah, whatever reason he did, because he's a Sahabi, he had a good intention, he had good intention for the Ummah, and he would either get 2 rewards or 1 reward. Why? Because when a scholar makes an ijtihad, a scholarly judgment, and he's right, he gets 2 rewards. If he's wrong, he gets 1 reward, but never is he sinful. Never is he sinful. So he either gets 2 rewards for a correct political decision, or 1 reward, but he's never sinful. Point being is, the reality is he's left Yazid, and Yazid is in a very precarious situation. If he doesn't get the backing of Al-Hussein, it means that the Ummah is becoming split. And Yazid has so many people behind him, and then Ibn Abbas and Ibn Umar agree and give bay'ah to him as well. But Abdullah ibn Zubayr and Al-Hussein don't. And Al-Hussein's simple thing is, you don't have the qualities. And if we're going to start like this, it's going to go downhill. So what Yazid does, Yazid gets one of his governors, they're in Medina now, okay? Ibn Zubayr and Al-Hussein are in Medina. And Yazid sends one of his governors to pressurize both of them to give the bay'ah. Give the bay'ah, or else. But we don't know what that or else is. Both Abdullah ibn al-Zubayr and Al-Hassan, Al-Hussein, they think, look, we're not going to give the bay'ah. We're not going to give they say in Urdu, bay'ah, the oath of allegiance. We're not going to give it to him, because we don't think he's deserving. But we're not going to stay here, because if their threat is true, that means something, they're going to send up a force against us, and we don't want something to happen in the city of the Prophet. Because it's the Muslim capital at the moment as well. Oh, it's not the Muslim capital because it became Kufa. It's the Muslim holy place still. So, I don't know where Ibn al-Zubayr goes to, but Al-Hussein makes his way to Makkah. And there in Makkah is Ibn Abbas and Ibn Umar. And he stays there for quite a few months. Just to let things calm down, to think what he's going to do. Whilst he's there, the people of Kufa, Iraq, are sending him tens and tens of letters. Every week, he's getting tens or hundreds of letters saying, come to us in Kufa, in Iraq, and we will support you, and we will give you the bay'ah. And there are about 60,000 of us. And then you can get the authority that way. And by the end of his stay in Makkah, he has over 500 requests and letters from the people of Kufa, which is quite a lot. So, through his piety and through his du'as, he decides, I will go to Kufa. But before I go, I can't just go like that. Let me send my cousin, Muhammad ibn Aqil. Okay? So if you're, well, we won't go into the history, but Muhammad ibn Aqil is the cousin. Okay? Because Muhammad ibn Aqil, he's the son of Aqil, and Aqil is the brother of Ali, sons of Abu Talib. So the connection is there. He sends Muhammad ibn Aqil to Kufa first, to test the grounds. Are the people of Kufa true to their word? Will they support me? Because I'm going to make that journey. So Aqil is going, Muhammad ibn Aqil is going. As Al-Hussein is thinking to set off, Ibn al-Zubayr tells him, don't do so. He says, will you go to a people who already betrayed your father, Ali radiallahu anhu? They did the same thing to Ali ibn Zubayr. They said, come to us and we will support you. By the time Ali radiallahu anhu got to them, the people of Kufa changed their minds politically. So he's saying to the son of the grandson of the Prophet that please don't go to Kufa. Those people will change their mind and they will betray you as they betrayed your father. Ibn Umar radiallahu anhu gave him advice, don't do so. Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu gave him advice, don't do so. But Al-Hussein sees this injustice in the form of Yazid and sees that if anyone can unite the Ummah, it's me, because I have the Prophet's blood. I am the son of the daughter of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Okay, and that counts for a lot. So he listens to the advice, but he still feels that he needs to go. So Ibn Abbas and Ibn Umar, who are in the 70s and the 80s, and they are from the greatest ulama at that time, they said that at least don't take your family and children, the wife and the children, and all the women and the children, leave them there. But he thought, no, they are better, safer with me than left without me. So off he goes, from Makkah to Kufa, against the better judgment of some of the senior Sahaba. And he's amongst the senior ones now as well. Radiallahu anhu. What happens is Muhammad ibn Aqil gets to Kufa before he does, and finds that, yes, they are true to their word. 40,000 of them are saying, we're ready to give him bay'ah. So he writes back to Hussein that, yes, I've come to Kufa, they've received me they welcome me, and received me lovingly and warmly, and they've given me their political support, and their support in arms and whatever. And he sends that letter back. Hussein gets that letter and he thinks, okay, let's make the journey. He's making the journey from Makkah through Iraq to get to Kufa, which is also in Iraq. Whilst he's making that journey, and there's about 72 of them, it is said there are about 40 cavalrymen, and the other 32 are him and children, his brother's children, Muhammad ibn Aqil's children, one of the children of Ali from his other wife, and just women. Okay, so mostly women and children, and at least 40 trained men. 72 people. That's what Ibn Kathir says in the Bidayah. And they're making this journey. And whilst they're making this journey, so when they're travelling now, they're out of the main cities. When you're out of the main cities, you're out of communication with the world. Muhammad ibn Aqil, what happens is, Yazid learns that Hussein is going to go to Kufa. And Yazid knows, if he reaches Kufa and the people give him bay'ah, give him the oath of allegiance, and people are giving Yazid the oath of allegiance, it's going to be a split, but sooner or later, popularity will be that people will start siding with Hussein. Sooner or later, he will have more people. So Yazid, just as a ruler would do, said, he needs to be stopped, not killed. He needs to be stopped, prevented from reaching Kufa so that the people can't give him an oath of allegiance. He sent his general, Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad. He said, I want you to be the governor of Kufa. Because there was a Sahabi who was the governor of Kufa. But Yazid, as far as Yazid is concerned, look, there's this Sahabi who's the governor of Kufa. And whilst he's the governor, 40,000 people have written to Hussein pledging allegiance. The governor hasn't done anything. So, kick him out, and I'll send in this governor. And Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad was, and he had proper army man, and he could be ruthless. He kicked out that Sahabi from governorship. He became governorship. He killed Muhammad ibn Aqil. Said, either you give bay'ah to Yazid, or else. And it was the or else. When many of the Kufans saw, they killed him, they beheaded him, and they threw his head out of a balcony onto the street. Many of the Kufans, we better go back home. And then some people, maybe through money, or through fear, or through bribery, or just through change of heart, or through lack of courage, whatever it be, most of them changed their mind and said, okay, we won't support Al-Hussein. So this political tidal change happens, but Hussein doesn't know this, and he's making his way to Kufa. As far as the last thing he knows is his cousin writes to him saying, all is fine, come to us. Don't even know his cousin is dead, brutally killed. It is now the year 61. That happened in 60. It's the year 61. Muharram, the first month. And Al-Hussein has made his way into Iraq, and he reaches a place called Karbala. And he even asks, where are we? And someone says, a place called Karbala. And Al-Hussein kind of is probably feeling that things aren't well. And he says, Karb wa bala. In Arabic, Karb means distress, anxieties, sorrow. And Bala means trials and tribulations. This is not why Karbala is Karbala, it's a Persian name. Karbala just is Karbala. But Hussein breaks it down into Karb Bala, meaning that this is not a good place to be. Right? And he is stopped by an army of about 3,000 to 4,000 people, men. And he said, basically, you're not going further. He says, well, if you're not allowing me to go further, and then he realizes that Muhammad ibn Aqil has been killed and the Kufians have changed their mind, then let me go back. They said, you're not going back. So Al-Hussein says, so what? You're not allowing me to, I am the son of the daughter of the Prophet. And you may have heard that the Prophet said about me and my brother, we are the leaders of the youth in paradise. And you may have heard that I am the grandson of the Prophet. So I adjure you by my right of being from the Ahlul Bayt, let me do one or the other. You can't just, me and my family, just not let us go and not let us go back. But they refused. And they made it clear that either he gives bay'ah or we will send the army against him. That was on the 2nd of Muharram. By that time, Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad, this governor, he put in charge of this army someone called Shimr ibn Dhil Jawshan. Shimr ibn Dhil Jawshan. And Shimr was even more brutal. Shimr said to the army, who he's the commander of, he said, don't let them get any water. They can't go back and they can't go forward. They can't go back to Makkah or Medina and they can't go enter into Kufa. And they can't have any water. So whatever food and water was with them for the next 8 days, that's what the 72 relied upon. It's a hot country, of course. And you're not expected to have water for 8 days, because you'd think you'll be in Kufa in 1 day. And so there was hunger and thirst, and children, and women. And on the 9th day, the commander sent an envoy saying, do you give bay'ah to Yazid? And he said, I will never give bay'ah to a man like Yazid. And then he said, then you have called upon yourself war. And he said, will it be war between 72 and 5,000? Because the number was for now 5,000. 5,000. And will you not let at least the children have water? And they denied all of this. So he said, then okay, if it's going to be war, then give us 1 night so that we can pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then you'll find us ready in the morning. Just 1 night is what we're asking. You've refused us water, you've refused us travel, you've refused us everything. So give us the time to pray to Allah Jalla wa'ala. And he agreed. So Al-Hussein told the people, the 72 people, what is happening. He said, whoever wants to leave can leave, but we will have to be here for morning. And nobody left. Nobody left. And Ibn Kathir says they made dua to Allah, they made tahajjud, they made dua, because these people, especially Al-Hussein, he was one of the great salihun, one of the great abidun, one of the great muhibbun, one of the great awliya. Okay? And they made dua to Allah and they made tahajjud. And in the morning, they faced the army. To cut a long story short, because Ibn Kathir and others go through some of the things that happened. But in the end of the day, the 10th of Muharram, what were 72 people going to do against training 5,000 soldiers? Children, mothers, women, 40 cavalrymen. And even they weren't all trained for war, maybe. Who knows what will happen. Maybe all of the cavalrymen died anyway. Got killed. Many of the children got killed. Many of the women got killed. Most got killed. Few survived. The children of Al-Hussein got killed. The children of Al-Hassan got killed. Muhammad ibn Aqil's son got killed. Ali radiallahu son from another wife got killed. That day, a lot of prophetic blood was spilled. A lot of blood of the Ahlul Bayt was spilled. And in the end, Shimr slit Al-Hussein's throat. And before he could die, he decapitated him as well. Chopped his head. eventually that blessed head that the Prophet once kissed on the forehead made its way back to the Khalifa Yazid. And Yazid wept. He said, I said to stop them, not to slaughter them. I just didn't want them to go to Kufa to have the political support, not to massacre them. But the deed was done. And history was recorded in blood. And the days turned dark. And it's probably fair to say that other than the passing away of the Prophet ﷺ, the Ummah has never been so shocked. The Ummah had never been so shocked as they were at the massacre of Al-Hussein and his family at Karbala on the 10th of Muharram in the year 61 Hijrah. And it's probably fair to say that the Ummah has never been so shocked ever since. It cut through the consciousness, the Muslim consciousness, and it struck all hearts. It didn't matter what political leaning you had, a Shi'i Rafida leaning or a Sunni leaning, all felt it was wrong, the massacre was wrong. By agreement, all believed the massacre to be wrong. All believed that Al-Hussein was madloom, done dhulm against, and his household. They differed as regards to the intentions of Yazid, some giving him the worst of intentions and charging him with the killing of Al-Hussein, some saying he just wanted Hussein to be stopped, and this is understandable if you're in the political context, which is what most of our historians and ulama like Ibn Kathir and others say. And some people with darkened hearts believe that Yazid wanted Al-Hussein to be killed, and it was a good thing to kill Hussein. And they were a group of people who, alhamdulillah, I don't think they exist anymore. And if they do, they're just little people here and there. They were called the Nasheed, those who hated the Ahlul Bayt. Right? Don't ask me how someone can hate the family of the Prophet, but we've had a sect in the history of Islam called the Nasheed, haters of the Ahlul Bayt, and they rejoice. And throughout Islamic history, they celebrated the death of Hussein, not as martyr, as celebration. But I don't know if such groups of people exist anymore as groups. Wallah. And the rest is history. The people who were already Shi'atun Ali, they were already the party of Ali, they already had some extremism in them, became even more extreme. They blamed the Umayyads, and because the Umayyads were defending Sunni Islam, it became a hatred towards Sunnism and anything and everything that it stands for. Their focus was on Yazid, hatred, and therefore his father Muawiyah, who is Sahabi. And because normally Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah take the position that all of the Sahaba are udul and just, radiyallahu anhum ajma'een. Yazid is not from the Sahaba, remember that. Then, you know, their hatred towards those who don't hate Muawiyah is just added to the long political theological list that they have, hatred against the Sunni folk. Some of the Sunni world remember this day through accounts and stories, but not martyrdom like the Shias do, flogging their backs, but remembering it in tales like this. Others didn't want to speak about it because it just ignites a sore spot. Okay? But it was a tragedy. It had nothing to do with the virtue of fasting on the 10th of Muharram, but it happened on the 10th of Muharram. The day that the Prophet's beloved was butchered by unjust people, and the day that much of the blood of the Ahlul Bayt was spilled. So to anyone who has an inclination to the Sunnah of the Prophet and to the Muhabba of Al-Mustafa, it's hard to it's hard for the heart not to grieve and not to feel sorrow. And the more the detail that we know about it, the more the heart weeps. And therefore, and thus, that is the whole summary of the 10th of Muharram and the tragedy of Karbala. The lessons to learn are probably this, as some of the ulama have said, that one, as a rule of thumb, whenever a believer encounters tragedies and the outrages of time, in whatever form they take, then he is told by Allah to withstand these tragedies and outrages with the medicine of sabr, of patience and self-restraint. But sabr, self-restraint and patience, whilst not being indifferent or apathetic, whilst not caring, one has to care at every tragedy, at every dhulm, at every injustice. We may care about them at different levels, but we need to care. The heart needs to bleed at some level and feel at some level every injustice, whether it's to a Muslim, whether it's to a non-Muslim, whatever injustice, the heart needs to bleed. And of course, the greater the injustice and the greater the person that injustice is connected with, the more the heart will naturally bleed. Nevertheless, Allah has told us that we withstand and confront and witness these tragedies and outrages of time through sabr, restraint, not being indifferent and not with apathy, but with self-restraint, with dignified response, because some tragedies, they require from us a response. Give money, roll up our sleeves and do khidmah, service, something it requires. So with restraint, dignified response, and righteous indignation, righteous anger for the sake of Allah, but an anger that doesn't split at the seams, right? And boil over into rage and uncontrolled despair and uncontrolled violence. No, that's not the way that Allah wants us to respond to any tragedy. Therefore, it is forbidden to take the 10th of Muharram as a day of ma'tam, as a day of mourning, whereby the mourning becomes a religiously fixed thing. Do not eat sweets, do not wear nice clothes, maybe even harm yourself just to feel the pain. We understand why. Imagine 72 people and they're not having water for 5-6 days in the heat, and they probably run out of food, and there are children already there. So there is some huge difficulty. It wasn't just a battle. 70 versus 5,000, that's bad enough. But before that, you almost starve them, and deny them water, and you don't allow them to go back, and they have half of their numbers are women and children. What kind of dhulm is this? What kind of dhulm is this? So some people feel that we need to feel that hurt, that musibah. And so they feel that they need to self-harm through flagellation. Of course, this is a bid'ah, it's wrong. But it's important it's not just a bid'ah, it's wrong, because the Prophet ﷺ told us, he is not one of us who, when he experiences a loss like a death of a near one, who slaps his cheek, pulls his hair out, and tears his clothes, and wails with the wailing of Jahiliyyah. Why? Because that's not sabr. And secondly, there is no denial. Wallahi, if Allah allows for my heart to act like the belief in it, I will tell you the belief of my heart, and which is the same, which I have no doubt is the same belief in your heart. All I hope is that my heart can do the action of the belief it holds. That aqeedatan, I love the Ahlul Bayt more than my children. Aqeedatan, aqeedah-wise, loving the Ahlul Bayt, the family, because he also loved them. And they are more deserving of love than our fathers and our children. Right? Nevertheless, prophets died on various days. And other awliya of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala died, and senior Sahaba died, tragically, and we don't do that. As regards to the Shia brothers, and as a rule of thumb, Shias are Muslims but have deviated in beliefs and practices, and some have deviated more than others. And the ulama who know, some of them believe clear-cut kufr, which would take them outside of the fold of Islam, but they would believe and know things that the average Shia may never know or believe. And if you add into there the difficult mix of taqiyya, that the Shias religiously are allowed to practice a form of lying, so that they could tell you one thing and believe totally the other thing. Nevertheless, as a rule of thumb, they're considered from the Muslim Ummah. They are considered to be people of La ilaha illallah, along with their bid'ah and along with their deviation. They are deviated and bid'ah Muslims, or Muslims like Ahlul Bid'ah. So those Shia, and some of them are outside of the fold of Islam because of their beliefs. But that's what the scholars determine. And it doesn't matter if, these Shias they're killing us here, Muslims killing Muslims doesn't mean automatically. Otherwise, all of Pakistan will be kafir and killing each other. Killing each other doesn't make someone kafir. It's haram to kill Muslims, of course. The mere killing doesn't mean you become a non-Muslim. Okay, so whatever treachery the Shias have done historically and in modern history, that's one thing. We're talking about beliefs now. But anyway, the Shia in general, they are unlikely to listen to the Sunni responses like this. Therefore, the rule of thumb is don't engage Shias on these issues. Let the ulama do so if they want to do so. But even the ulama know it's not worth talking to people who are whipped up on the 10th in Muharram in a state of frenzy. Imagine someone in your family dies horrifically and unexpectedly they die, and how you feel. And then someone comes and says to you, Sharia-wise, you should do janazah like this, and you should do this, and you shouldn't do that. You're not ready to accept because you're too emotional. Imagine you have nearly 1,400 years worth of teaching to make you religiously emotional. You're hardly going to get through. So it's probably not trying to worth confronting. And then there are Shias who all they want is not the truth. They want to entrap you. So what's your view on Yazid? You may have read something that Al-Ghazali said, he wasn't a kafir, he wasn't a wicked person, but he wasn't a righteous person. You might have read something like that. And so you just say it. And they say, so you love people who drink. But you don't believe Yazid drank. But they just want to make that type of imtihan. So it never does any well. It never does any. What it is we should just know, so that we're not confused, that our children and community are not confused. And if there is a sincere Shia who just wants to know the truth, we may be able to say a few positive things, inshallah. But as regards to munaqasha and debates, it has no value. Second thing is, it reminds us how to deal with other tragedies. Restraint, dignified response, righteous indignation or hating for the sake of Allah against the injustice, but never one that spills over in uncontrolled rage, violence, hatred, and fighting injustice with injustice. Sabr has to be there. And thirdly, it just reminds us that, subhanAllah, Allah still, even after Karbala, allowed the lineage of the Ahlul Bayt to survive. Okay? And those who upheld the Sunnah from the Ahlul Bayt I'm talking about, not the Shia Ahlul Bayt, which are also some of the Shia, the bloodline of the Prophet, but I'm talking about Sunni Ahlul Bayt. And so they combine the knowledge of the Sunnah and the blood of the family of the Prophet, and they are, inshallah, worthy of taking knowledge and suluk from and having suhbah with. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless and protect the remaining Ahlul Bayt that live on this earth, especially those who uphold the Sunnah and the Sharia. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He attaches our hearts to them. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He incline us towards them, as well as all other scholars, because scholars are scholars. Because it is said in one authentic hadith that the Ahlul Bayt are like the Ark of Noah. Whoever boards it is safe, Whoever doesn't, isn't. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وآله وصحبه أجمعين سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين الحمد لله رب العالمين. كربلاء محمد. Any questions?
What I was said on